The scorching heat of Paris Island hit Sarah Chen like a wall of fire as she stepped off the bus with 37 other recruits. The drill instructors were already shouting, their voices cutting through the humid South Carolina air like knives. Sarah kept her eyes forward, her face showing no emotion, even as sweat began to form on her brow. "Welcome to hell, maggots," Drill Instructor Staff Sergeant Rodriguez bellowed. "You think you're tough? You think you're warriors? You're nothing but soft civilians who wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real fight." The other recruits shifted nervously, some already looking defeated before training had even begun. Sarah remained perfectly still, her military bearing already evident to anyone who knew what to look for. But the drill instructors were too busy establishing dominance to notice the subtle signs. As the group was herded toward the processing building, Sarah caught snippets of conversation from the male recruits around her. Most had come straight from high school or college, their biggest challenges being final exams or part-time jobs. They talked nervously about what they'd heard about Marine training, sharing stories from movies and video games. "I heard they don't let you sleep for the first week," whispered a tall, lanky recruit named Thompson. "My cousin said the food is so bad you lose 30 pounds, added another, a stocky young man named Martinez, who looked like he could afford to lose the weight. Sarah said nothing. She had learned long ago that listening was more valuable than talking, especially when you were gathering intelligence about your new environment. These boys had no idea what real hardship looked like, what real combat felt like, or what it meant to have someone's life depend entirely on your ability to remain calm under pressure. The processing took hours. Medical examinations, paperwork, uniform fittings, and countless briefings about rules and regulations. Through it all, Sarah moved with quiet efficiency, answering questions when asked but volunteering nothing extra. She noticed how the drill instructors seemed to pay special attention to her, not because they suspected anything, but because she was one of only 4 women in the platoon. "Chen," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez barked as they were being assigned to barracks. "You think because you're a woman we're going to go easy on you?" "No, sir," Sarah replied crisply. "Good, because I'm going to make your life twice as hard as everyone else's. Women don't belong in my Marine Corps. But since the politicians say you get to be here, you're going to prove you deserve it every single day." The other recruits smirked and exchanged glances. They assumed this small Asian woman would be the first to wash out, the first to crack under pressure. They had no way of knowing that Sarah had already survived things that would break most of them before breakfast. That first night in the barracks, as recruits whispered nervously about what tomorrow would bring, Sarah lay silently on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Her mind wasn't on the challenges ahead. She had faced far worse. Instead, she was remembering another time, another place, where the stakes had been life and death, rather than just pride and a few extra push-ups. 3 years earlier, Sarah had been Sergeant Sarah Chen, United States Army Special Operations. She had been deployed to Afghanistan as part of a joint task force conducting counterterrorism operations in the most dangerous regions of the country. Her specialty was long-range reconnaissance and elimination of high-value targets. In the civilian world, people called it being a sniper. In her world, it was called saving lives by taking them. The mission that had changed everything happened on a ridge overlooking the Kunar Valley. Intelligence had identified a Taliban commander who was planning a major attack on a nearby village where American forces were training local police. The man was responsible for numerous improvised explosive device attacks that had killed both American soldiers and Afghan civilians. Sarah had been positioned on the ridge for 18 hours, waiting for the perfect shot. The target was surrounded by civilians, including children, making the operation extremely complex. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation or poor judgment, could result in innocent deaths. When the moment came, Sarah had less than 3 seconds to take the shot before the target moved into a crowd of school children. The distance was over 800 meters, with shifting wind conditions, and the added pressure of knowing that failure meant the deaths of dozens of innocent people in the planned attack. She took the shot. The target was eliminated. The planned attack was prevented. It was her 47th confirmed elimination, though the military preferred the term neutralization in official reports. But the recruits sleeping around her now would never know any of this. Sarah had left the army after completing her enlistment, burned out from years of deployment and the constant weight of life and death decisions. She had tried civilian life for 6 months, working as a security consultant, but found herself restless and unfulfilled. The Marine Corps represented a new challenge, a chance to serve again but in a different capacity. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now being treated like a complete novice by instructors who had never fired a shot in anger, while men who had never held a rifle outside of basic training assumed she was weak simply because of her gender. The next morning began at 4:30 with the sound of trash cans being thrown down the center aisle of the barracks. The drill instructors stormed in, screaming and shouting, flipping over bunks and demanding that everyone be dressed and outside in 2 minutes. Sarah was ready in 90 seconds, standing at attention while chaos swirled around her. She watched with mild interest as her fellow recruits stumbled around, trying to put on uniforms incorrectly, some still half asleep and confused. "Chen," Drill Instructor Sergeant Williams approached her, his face inches from hers. "You think you're hot stuff because you got dressed fast?" "No, sir." "Then why are you standing there looking so smug?" Sarah wasn't looking smug. Her expression was completely neutral, but she knew better than to argue with a drill instructor. "No excuse, sir. No excuse. Drop and give me 20 push-ups for having an attitude." As Sarah dropped to the push-up position, she heard snickers from some of the male recruits. They were enjoying seeing the woman get singled out for punishment. She cranked out 20 perfect push-ups without showing any strain, then popped back to attention. "Is that all you got?" William sneered. "20 more." Again, Sarah completed the push-ups flawlessly. By now, some of the other recruits were starting to look impressed despite themselves. But the drill instructors weren't done with her yet. The first week of training was a blur of physical fitness tests, classroom instruction, and constant harassment from the drill instructors. The recruits learned basic military customs and courtesies, the history of the Marine Corps, and began their introduction to combat training. During physical fitness assessments, Sarah consistently scored in the top 5% of all recruits, male and female. Her pull-ups were flawless, her run times were exceptional, and her endurance seemed limitless. But rather than earning respect, her performance only seemed to annoy the drill instructors more. "Chen thinks she's better than everyone else," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez announced to the platoon during one particularly brutal training session. "She thinks because she can do a few pull-ups, she's ready to be a Marine. What do you think about that, recruits?" "Sir, no sir," the platoon responded in unison, though Sarah noticed that some voices were less enthusiastic than others. The harassment intensified. Sarah found herself being assigned extra duties, receiving more intensive inspections, and being singled out for criticism even when her performance was flawless. The other recruits began to see her as a lightning rod for unwanted attention and started to distance themselves from her. But Sarah had been through worse. Much worse. She remembered missions where she had gone days without sleep, where she had been pinned down by enemy fire for hours, where she had to make split-second decisions that determined whether her team lived or died. A few angry drill instructors and some extra push-ups were nothing compared to that. What bothered her more was the attitude of her fellow recruits. During the few moments of downtime they were allowed, she overheard constant conversations about how women didn't belong in the military, how they were weakening the Corps, and how she was probably only there to prove some political point. "I bet she doesn't make it through the first month," Thompson whispered to Martinez during one evening meal. "She's probably never even fired a gun before." "My sister went through basic training in the Army," Martinez replied. "She said most of the women there were just looking for easy benefits and a husband." Sarah continued eating her meal, giving no indication that she had heard them. She had learned long ago not to react to ignorance with anger. Instead, she simply filed the information away, noting who could be trusted and who couldn't. The physical training continued to intensify. Long runs in full gear, obstacle courses designed to push recruits to their limits, and combat exercises that left most of the platoon exhausted and demoralized. Through it all, Sarah performed at a level that would have been impressive for a seasoned Marine, let alone a recruit. During a particularly challenging combat exercise, the platoon was required to low crawl under barbed wire, while drill instructors fired blank ammunition over their heads and set off simulated explosions nearby. The exercise was designed to simulate combat conditions and test how recruits reacted under pressure. Most of the recruits were clearly terrified. Some froze completely and had to be dragged forward by the drill instructors. Others panicked and tried to rush, only to get tangled in the wire and cut up badly enough to require medical attention. Sarah moved through the course like she was taking a leisurely stroll through a park. She kept low, moved efficiently, and showed absolutely no reaction to the simulated gunfire and explosions going off around her. When she reached the end of the course, she wasn't even breathing hard. Drill instructor Williams was waiting for her. "You think this is a game, Chen?" "No, sir." "Then why do you look so relaxed? This is supposed to be stressful." "I am feeling stress, sir." It wasn't exactly a lie. Sarah was feeling stress, but not from the exercise. Her stress came from having to constantly bite her tongue and pretend to be something she wasn't. The simulated combat conditions weren't stressful. They were almost nostalgic. As the weeks progressed, the divide between Sarah and the rest of the platoon grew wider. Her exceptional performance continued to draw unwanted attention from the drill instructors, who seemed determined to find her breaking point. Meanwhile, her fellow recruits grew more resentful of what they saw as showing off. The breaking point came during week 6, during a field exercise that was supposed to simulate a combat patrol. The platoon was divided into fire teams and given a mission to reach a specific objective, while avoiding enemy forces played by advanced training instructors. Sarah found herself assigned to a team led by Thompson, the same recruit who had been predicting her failure since day 1. The team also included Martinez and a quiet recruit named Johnson, who rarely spoke to anyone. The mission seemed straightforward enough, but Sarah quickly realized that Thompson had no idea what he was doing. His tactical movements were sloppy. He was making far too much noise, and he was leading the team directly into an obvious ambush point. "Thompson," Sarah whispered as they approached a narrow valley between 2 hills. "We should go around. This is a perfect kill zone." "Nobody asked you, Chen," Thompson snapped back. "I'm the team leader here. I understand that, but if we go through that valley, we're going to get ambushed. Are you questioning my authority?" Sarah looked at the valley ahead, then at the faces of her teammates. Johnson looked nervous, clearly sensing that something was wrong but not sure what. Martinez was just following orders, trusting that Thompson knew what he was doing. In a real combat situation, Sarah would have taken command regardless of rank or protocol. Lives would have been on the line, and she had the experience and training to keep her team alive. But this was just an exercise, with blank ammunition and simulated casualties, or so she thought. As the team moved into the valley, Sarah's combat instincts were screaming warnings. Something felt wrong, different from the other training exercises they had conducted. The instructors playing the enemy forces were too well positioned, too professional in their movements. Then she saw the glint of metal on the ridgeline above them, and her blood turned to ice. That wasn't a training weapon. That was a real rifle scope. And it was pointed directly at Thompson's head. Without thinking, Sarah reacted with the speed and precision that had kept her alive through dozens of real combat missions. She tackled Thompson, driving him to the ground, just as the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the valley. The bullet that would have killed Thompson instead shattered a rock 6 inches from where his head had been a split second earlier. Chaos erupted. The instructors who had been playing enemy forces were suddenly shouting real commands, not training scenarios. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of live ammunition being fired, not the blanks they had been using in exercises. "Contact. Real contact. This is not a drill." Someone was screaming into a radio. Sarah's training kicked in completely. She assessed the situation in seconds. They were pinned down in a kill zone, with at least 2 enemy shooters on the ridgeline above them. The rest of her team was frozen in terror, having never experienced real combat before. "Johnson, Martinez, get behind that boulder now," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life or death situations. For once, no one questioned her orders. The 3 male recruits scrambled for cover, while Sarah assessed their tactical situation. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and trapped in the worst possible position. But Sarah had been in worse situations before. Much worse. As another shot rang out, chipping stone from their cover, Sarah began to formulate a plan. She would have to draw the enemy fire while her teammates escaped. Then eliminate the threat, using skills she had hoped never to use again. The scared recruits huddled behind the boulder had no idea that the woman they had been mocking and dismissing was about to save all their lives, using methods that would have impressed their drill instructors beyond their wildest imagination. Sarah Chen was done pretending to be a rookie. Lives were on the line now, and that changed everything. Sarah's mind shifted into combat mode, a mental state she had hoped never to enter again. The familiar calm descended over her as she analyzed the tactical situation with the cold precision that had kept her alive through countless missions in Afghanistan. 2 shooters on the ridge, approximately 400 meters out. Wind conditions minimal. Cover available but limited. 3 untrained civilians depending on her for survival. No backup coming anytime soon. "Stay down and don't move unless I tell you," she whispered to Thompson, Martinez, and Johnson. The authority in her voice was unmistakable now, completely different from the quiet recruit they thought they knew. "What's happening?" Thompson's voice cracked with panic. "Are we really being shot at?" "Yes, and if you want to live through this, you need to follow my instructions exactly." Sarah was already studying the ridgeline, identifying muzzle flashes, and calculating angles. "Johnson, do you still have that radio?" Johnson nodded, his hands shaking as he pulled out the communication device they had been using for the training exercise. "Call for immediate backup. Tell them we have real contact with armed hostiles at grid coordinates." Sarah rattled off numbers that she had calculated by reading the terrain, a skill that had taken her years to master. "Tell them we need a medical evacuation standing by." "Why medical?" Martinez asked, his face pale. "Because someone's going to get hurt before this is over," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. She was scanning their limited cover, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. The M16 rifles they carried were loaded with blank ammunition, useless against a real threat. Another shot cracked overhead. This one closer. Sarah could tell from the sound that the shooters were using high-powered rifles. Probably hunting rifles with decent scopes, professional enough to be dangerous, but not military-grade equipment. "Who are they?" Thompson whispered. Sarah had been wondering the same thing. This wasn't a terrorist attack or a military assault. The shooting was too sporadic, too undisciplined. Her best guess was locals, possibly anti-government extremists who had decided to take advantage of military training exercises to make some kind of statement. "Doesn't matter who they are," she said. "What matters is getting out of here alive." She spotted what she needed. A large piece of shrapnel from an old artillery shell that had been used in previous training exercises. It was about 8 inches long, and sharp enough to serve as a makeshift weapon. Not ideal, but better than nothing. "I'm going to move to that outcrop over there." Sarah pointed to a rocky formation about 30 meters away. "When I do, they're going to shoot at me. That's your chance to move back toward the valley entrance. Stay low, move fast, and don't look back." "You can't do that," Johnson protested. "You'll be killed." Sarah looked at him with the same expression she had worn when preparing for sniper missions in Afghanistan. "That's my problem, not yours. Your job is to get to safety and call for help." Before any of them could protest further, Sarah was moving. She sprinted toward the outcrop in a zigzag pattern, using every piece of cover available. The enemy shooters took the bait immediately, their rifles cracking as they tried to track her movement. Sarah dove behind the rocky outcrop, just as bullets chipped stone inches from her head. Behind her, she could hear her teammates moving toward safety as instructed. At least part of her plan was working. Now came the hard part. Sarah had to neutralize 2 armed enemies, using nothing but improvised weapons and the element of surprise. In Afghanistan, she would have had military-grade equipment, backup, and detailed intelligence about enemy positions. Here, she had a piece of shrapnel, and whatever she could improvise. She studied the ridgeline carefully, timing the intervals between shots. The shooters were maintaining their positions, confident that they had their targets pinned down. That confidence would be their downfall. Sarah began to move, using skills she had honed through years of special operations training. She climbed up the backside of the ridge, moving through terrain that would have been impossible for most people to navigate silently. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to avoid detection. It took her 45 minutes to work her way around to a position where she could observe the enemy shooters without being seen. What she found confirmed her suspicions. Two men in hunting gear, armed with civilian rifles. They looked like local hunters or possibly militia members, not trained soldiers. The first man was positioned behind a fallen tree. His attention focused entirely on the valley below where he thought his targets were trapped. He had no idea that one of those targets was now less than 20 feet behind him. Sarah moved like a ghost, using techniques she had learned from Army Rangers and refined through real combat experience. The man never knew she was there until her improvised weapon found the pressure point on his neck that would render him unconscious without permanent injury. One down, one to go. The second shooter was more alert, positioned where he could watch both the valley and the surrounding area. Sarah would have to be more creative with him. She found a small rock, about the size of a baseball, and threw it to create a distraction, about 50 feet from the second shooter's position. When he turned to investigate the sound, Sarah moved with lightning speed, closing the distance before he could react. The struggle was brief but intense. The man was larger and stronger than Sarah, but she had advantages he couldn't match. Years of hand-to-hand combat training and the absolute determination that came from knowing other people's lives depended on her success. When it was over, both shooters were unconscious and secured with their own belts and shoelaces. Sarah had appropriated one of their hunting rifles, checking it carefully to ensure it was in working condition. Only then did she allow herself to feel the familiar aftermath of combat. The slight tremor in her hands, the heightened awareness that made every sound seem amplified, the cold certainty that she had done what was necessary to protect innocent lives. She made her way back to the valley where her teammates were waiting with a growing group of drill instructors and base security personnel. The radio call had brought half the base running, and the area was now swarming with military police and medical personnel. Chen. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was striding toward her, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "What the hell happened up there? Where have you been?" "Neutralizing the threat, sir," Sarah replied, holding up the hunting rifle. "Two subjects secured on the ridgeline. They'll need medical attention. But they're not going anywhere." The silence that followed was profound. Every drill instructor, every security officer, every medic in the area was staring at this small female recruit who had just casually announced that she had single-handedly captured two armed attackers. "You did what?" Rodriguez's voice was barely a whisper. Thompson stepped forward, his face still pale from the experience. "Sir, she saved our lives. We were pinned down, and she just took care of it. Like it was nothing. She moved like a professional," Martinez added. "Like she'd done this before." Rodriguez looked from the recruits to Sarah, his expression slowly changing as understanding began to dawn. "Chen, I need to ask you some questions. Right now." The debriefing took 6 hours. Sarah found herself in a room with base command staff, military intelligence officers, and investigators from multiple agencies. They wanted to know everything. How she had identified the threat, how she had neutralized it, and most importantly, where she had learned the skills to do so. Sarah had been dreading this moment since the day she arrived at Paris Island. She had hoped to keep her military background quiet, to simply complete Marine training like any other recruit, but that was no longer possible. Sergeant Chen, the base commander, Colonel Morrison, was reviewing a file that had been rushed over from Army personnel records. "It says here that you served 3 deployments in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment, specialized training in long-range reconnaissance and target elimination." "Yes, sir." 47 confirmed. "Neutralizations." "Yes, sir." The room fell silent again. Finally, Colonel Morrison looked up from the file. "Sergeant Chen, why didn't you inform us of your background when you enlisted?" Sarah had prepared for this question. "Sir, I wanted to serve as a Marine, not as an Army veteran. I wanted to earn my place through Marine training, not through my previous service record. And you thought the best way to do that was to pretend to be a complete novice?" "Yes, sir. I felt it was the most honest approach." Colonel Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah carefully. "Sergeant Chen, do you have any idea how this looks?" A highly trained special operations veteran pretending to be a basic recruit? My drill instructors have been treating you like you've never held a weapon before. I understand the situation is complicated, sir. Complicated? Morrison almost smiled. Sergeant Chen. My drill instructors have been trying to break you for 6 weeks. They've been assuming you're a weak civilian who doesn't belong in the military. Meanwhile, you've been sitting there with more combat experience than most of them will ever have. The implications were starting to sink in around the room. Sarah had been enduring harassment and discrimination based on the assumption that she was unqualified and inexperienced, when in reality she was one of the most qualified soldiers anyone in the room had ever encountered. Sir, Rodriguez spoke up hesitantly. If I may ask, why did she let us treat her that way? Why didn't she say something? Colonel Morrison looked at Sarah. That's a very good question. Sergeant Chen? Sarah considered her answer carefully. Sir, I've learned that respect has to be earned. Regardless of previous accomplishments, I wanted to earn my place as a Marine through Marine training, not through my Army service record, even when that meant enduring harassment and discrimination. Yes, sir. I felt it was more important to prove myself through actions than through credentials. The colonel was quiet for a long moment. Sergeant Chen, what you did today saved lives. Your teammates speak very highly of your actions under fire. However, your decision to conceal your background has created a significant problem for this training program. Sarah waited, knowing that her future in the Marines was about to be decided. I'm transferring you out of recruit training, Morrison announced. You'll be assigned to our advanced combat training program, where your skills can be properly utilized and developed. Sir, I request to be allowed to complete basic training with my platoon. Morrison looked surprised. Sergeant Chen, you've already proven that basic training is far below your capabilities. Why would you want to continue? Because I started this with these people, sir. They're my teammates, and I'd like to finish what we started together. Around the room, the staff officers were exchanging glances. This was not the response they had expected from someone with Sarah's background and capabilities. Rodriguez cleared his throat. Sir, if I may, the platoon could benefit from having someone with Sergeant Chen's experience. If she's willing to continue, and if we adjust our training approach, Colonel Morrison considered this. You understand, Sergeant Chen, that we can no longer treat you as an ordinary recruit. Your cover, so to speak, has been blown. I understand, sir, and you understand that your fellow recruits are going to have questions. A lot of questions. Sarah nodded. She had been dreading this moment as much as she had been anticipating it. For 6 weeks, she had been able to serve anonymously, to be judged on her performance rather than her reputation. That anonymity was gone forever. Very well, Morrison decided. You'll return to your platoon, but we're going to modify your training program. You'll assist with instruction of combat techniques, and we'll be incorporating more advanced scenarios into the curriculum. As Sarah left the debriefing, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The secret was out, which meant no more pretending to be something she wasn't, but it also meant facing her fellow recruits, who would now know that the woman they had been mocking and dismissing was actually one of the most combat-experienced soldiers any of them were likely to ever meet. The walk back to the barracks felt longer than usual. Sarah knew that everything was about to change, and she wasn't sure if it would be for better or worse. When she opened the barracks door, 36 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Word had already spread, as it always did in military units. The same recruits who had been snickering about her supposed inexperience were now staring at her with expressions ranging from awe to embarrassment. Thompson was the first to speak. Is it true? About Afghanistan? Sarah nodded quietly. How many? Johnson started to ask, then stopped himself. Enough, Sarah replied simply. Martinez stepped forward. We owe you an apology. All of us. Sarah looked around the room at faces she had grown familiar with over the past 6 weeks. These were the same people who had questioned whether she belonged in the military, who had assumed she was weak because of her gender, who had treated her as an outsider. No, she said finally. You don't owe me anything. We're all here for the same reason, to become Marines. Everything else is just details. But even as she said it, Sarah knew that everything had changed. The questions would continue. The assumptions would be different, and the dynamic of the platoon would never be the same. She had wanted to serve anonymously, to be judged on her performance as a Marine rather than her reputation as an Army veteran. That was no longer possible. Now she would have to find a new way to earn the respect of her fellow recruits, not as someone pretending to be inexperienced, but as someone whose experience might be both an asset and a barrier to acceptance. The real test was just beginning. The next morning brought a completely different atmosphere to the platoon. Sarah woke to find that someone had left a cup of coffee on her footlocker, a small gesture that would have been unthinkable just days before. The same recruits who had been treating her as an outsider were now watching her every move with curiosity and respect. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez entered the barracks with his usual morning fury. But when his eyes met Sarah's, there was a moment of hesitation that hadn't been there before. The dynamic between drill instructor and recruit had fundamentally shifted overnight. "Listen up, maggots," Rodriguez bellowed, though his voice seemed slightly less harsh than usual. "We're making some changes to the training program. Chen, you're going to be assisting with combat instruction. The rest of you are going to learn what real military training looks like." The reaction from the platoon was immediate. Some recruits looked excited at the prospect of learning from someone with actual combat experience. Others appeared nervous, suddenly realizing that their assumptions about military service had been completely wrong. During morning physical training, Sarah found herself in an unusual position. The drill instructors were now acknowledging her expertise rather than trying to break her down, but she was still technically a recruit like everyone else. The balance was delicate and strange. "Chen, demonstrate proper firing position for the others," drill instructor Williams commanded during weapons training. It was the first time any recruit had been asked to demonstrate anything for their fellow trainees. Sarah moved into position with fluid efficiency, her body automatically adjusting to accommodate the rifle's weight and balance. Every movement was precise and professional, displaying muscle memory developed through thousands of hours of training and real-world application. "Notice how Chen controls her breathing," Williams explained to the watching recruits. "Notice the stability of her platform, the consistency of her grip. This is what professional marksmanship looks like." Thompson raised his hand hesitantly. "Drill instructor Williams, how many? What kind of missions?" Williams cut him off with a sharp look. "That's not your concern, recruit. Your concern is learning what Chen has to teach you about staying alive in combat." But the questions continued throughout the day, whispered during meals and brief rest periods. Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way she had never wanted to be. The anonymity she had cherished was completely gone. "Is it true you killed 47 people?" Martinez asked quietly during evening chow. Sarah put down her fork and looked at him steadily. "I eliminated threats that were endangering American lives and mission objectives. The number isn't what's important. But how do you deal with that? How do you live with it?" It was a question Sarah had asked herself countless times, had discussed with military counselors, and had struggled with during her transition to civilian life. "You remember why you did it," she said finally. "You remember the lives you saved, the missions you completed, and the people who came home because you did your job." Johnson, who had been quiet during most of these conversations, spoke up. "Were you scared when you went after those shooters yesterday?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Fear is a tool," she said. "It keeps you alert, keeps you focused. The trick is not letting it control your actions." These conversations continued for days, and gradually Sarah began to understand that her revelation was having a positive effect on the platoon. The other recruits were taking training more seriously, asking better questions, and pushing themselves harder. They had been exposed to what real military service looked like, and it was inspiring them to rise to that level. But the change wasn't just in the other recruits. The drill instructors were also adapting to the new dynamic. Rather than trying to tear Sarah down, they were incorporating her experience into their instruction methods. "Chen," Rodriguez said during a tactical movement exercise, "what would you do differently in this scenario?" Sarah studied the setup. A simulated patrol through hostile territory. The standard training approach was adequate for basic instruction, but it missed several key elements that could mean the difference between life and death in actual combat. "The point man is moving too fast," she observed. "In real terrain like this, you'd want to take more time to scan for improvised explosive devices. Also, the spacing between team members is too tight. One grenade or mortar round could take out the entire squad." Rodriguez nodded and adjusted the exercise accordingly. The recruits moved through the scenario again, this time with more realistic spacing and movement techniques. "Better," Sarah commented. "But watch your noise discipline. In a real combat zone, that much talking would get everyone killed." The integration of Sarah's experience into the training program was happening organically, and the results were impressive. The entire platoon was performing at a higher level. And more importantly, they were developing the mindset necessary for effective military service. But not everyone was comfortable with the changes. During week 8 of training, Sarah was approached by recruit Davis, one of the few recruits who hadn't participated in the group discussions about her background. "I don't think this is fair," Davis said bluntly. "You already went through military training once. You're getting special treatment, and it's making the rest of us look bad." Sarah understood his frustration. "I'm not getting special treatment," she replied. "I'm being held to the same standards as everyone else. Are you kidding? The drill instructors treat you completely differently now. They ask your opinion. They use you as an example. Meanwhile, the rest of us are still getting screamed at for minor mistakes." It was a valid point, and one that Sarah had been concerned about herself. The revelation of her background had definitely changed how she was treated, despite her desire to be judged as just another recruit. "What would you like me to do about it?" Sarah asked. Davis seemed surprised by the question. "I don't know. Maybe you should have stayed in the army if you were so good at it." "I chose to join the Marines because I wanted a new challenge," Sarah said. "I wanted to learn what it meant to be a Marine, not just a soldier. And you thought lying about your background was the way to do that?" "I didn't lie. I just didn't volunteer information that wasn't requested." Davis walked away, clearly unsatisfied with her response. Sarah realized that her presence was creating division within the platoon, something she had hoped to avoid. The issue came to a head during week 9. During a field exercise that was designed to test everything the recruits had learned so far. The platoon was divided into 2 squads and given a mission to capture and hold a strategic position against opposition forces. Sarah found herself assigned to the squad that included Davis, Thompson, Martinez, and several others. The squad leader was recruit Williams. Not the drill instructor, but a recruit who shared the same last name, who had shown natural leadership abilities throughout training. The mission started well. Williams developed a solid plan of attack, assigned roles effectively, and led the squad toward their objective with appropriate caution. But as they approached the target area, Sarah noticed something that made her combat instincts flare. The opposition forces were positioned too well, their defensive setup was too sophisticated, and their movement patterns were too professional. This wasn't being conducted by drill instructors or other recruits. Someone had brought in experienced personnel to make the exercise more challenging. "Williams," Sarah said quietly, "I think we need to reconsider the approach." "Why?" Williams asked, though he had learned to trust Sarah's tactical assessments. "This isn't a normal training setup. Look at the defensive positions, the fields of fire, the coordination between their elements. We're facing people with real experience." Williams studied the target area more carefully and began to see what Sarah was pointing out. "What do you recommend?" Before Sarah could answer, Davis interrupted. "Are we really going to let her take over again? This is supposed to be Williams' command." The comment created instant tension within the squad. Sarah could see the other recruits looking back and forth between her and Davis, uncertain how to respond. "I'm not trying to take command," Sarah said calmly. "I'm providing tactical advice to the squad leader, which is what any experienced team member should do." "Experienced team member?" Davis's voice was rising. "You're a recruit, just like the rest of us." "Davis, keep your voice down," Williams warned. "We're supposed to be conducting a stealth approach." But Davis was beyond listening to warnings. "No, I'm tired of pretending this is normal. She gets treated differently. She gets asked for her opinion on everything. and now she's trying to take over our mission. The argument was getting loud enough to compromise their position, and Sarah could see movement from the opposing forces that suggested they had been detected. "Contact front," someone shouted from the defensive position ahead of them. Simulated gunfire erupted from multiple positions as the opposition forces opened fire on the arguing squad. In a real combat situation, several members of the squad would already be dead or wounded. "Move! Move! Move!" Williams shouted, trying to get his people to cover, but the squad's response was uncoordinated and panicked. The argument between Sarah and Davis had disrupted unit cohesion at the worst possible moment. Recruits were running in different directions, seeking individual cover rather than moving as a coordinated team. Sarah found herself behind a fallen log with Thompson and Martinez, while Williams and Davis were pinned down about 50 feet away, behind a rocky outcrop. The opposition forces had effectively split the squad and were now concentrating fire to prevent them from reuniting. "We need to move to support Williams," Thompson said, loading a fresh magazine of blank ammunition into his rifle. "Negative," Sarah replied, studying the tactical situation. "If we move now, we'll be crossing multiple fields of fire. We need to create a distraction first." "What kind of distraction?" Sarah was already moving, circling around to a position where she could observe the opposition forces' setup. What she saw confirmed her earlier suspicions. These weren't drill instructors or recruits playing opposing forces. These were experienced Marines, possibly instructors from advanced combat schools, brought in to create a realistic training scenario. The level of professionalism in their defensive setup was impressive. Interlocking fields of fire, good use of cover and concealment, coordinated movement between positions. This was exactly the kind of opposition that real Marines would face in combat. Sarah began to develop a plan. It would require using skills and knowledge that went far beyond basic recruit training. But the alternative was accepting defeat in a scenario that was supposed to test their abilities. She moved back to Thompson and Martinez's position. "I'm going to create an opportunity for you to reach Williams and Davis. When I give the signal, move fast and stay low." "What are you going to do?" "Something that's going to get me in trouble with the instructors," Sarah admitted. She began to move through the terrain with the stealth and precision that had made her so effective in Afghanistan. The opposition forces were good, but they were expecting to face basic recruits using basic tactics. They weren't prepared for someone with advanced special operations training. Sarah worked her way around to the flank of the defensive position, using ground that the opposition forces had probably dismissed as impassable for recruits. It took her 20 minutes to get into position. But when she was ready, she had a clear view of the entire defensive setup. She keyed her radio. "Thompson, when you hear sustained fire from your 11 o'clock position, move to link up with Williams. You'll have about 30 seconds before they can reorient on your position." "Roger." Sarah opened fire with her blank-loaded rifle. Not randomly, but with carefully aimed shots that forced the opposition forces to believe they were taking fire from a full squad. She moved between positions rapidly, creating the impression of multiple attackers and drawing attention away from her trapped teammates. The distraction worked perfectly. Thompson and Martinez were able to reach Williams and Davis, and the reunited squad was able to coordinate their assault on the objective. But Sarah's tactics had not gone unnoticed by the opposition forces. As the exercise concluded and the participating forces gathered for the after-action review, it was clear that her performance had raised some eyebrows. Recruit Chen, the opposition force commander, a Marine captain named Stevens, approached her during the debriefing. "Interesting tactics you used out there." "Thank you, sir." "Where did you learn flanking maneuvers like that? That's not standard recruit curriculum." Sarah glanced around at her fellow recruits, who were listening intently. "Previous military experience?" "Sir?" Captain Stevens nodded slowly. "I thought so. We don't usually see movement that sophisticated from recruits. You've clearly had advanced training." The rest of the platoon was now staring at Sarah with a mixture of awe and something approaching resentment. Davis in particular looked angry, as if her performance had somehow been unfair to the rest of them. Drill instructor Rodriguez stepped in. "Captain Stevens, Recruit Chen is completing Marine basic training despite her Army background. We're working to integrate her experience in a way that benefits the entire platoon." "And how's that working out?" Stevens asked, looking around at the mixed reactions from the other recruits. "It's complicated," Rodriguez admitted. That evening, Sarah was called to another meeting with the base command staff. Colonel Morrison was reviewing the after-action report from the day's exercise, and his expression was thoughtful. "Sergeant Chen," he began, using her Army rank rather than referring to her as a recruit. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week. You said you wanted to earn your place as a Marine through Marine training, not through your Army credentials." "Yes, sir. But what happened today suggests that may not be possible. Your performance was exceptional, but it was exceptional because of skills you learned in the Army, not skills you're learning here." Sarah had been dreading this conversation. "Sir, I understand the complexity of the situation. Do you?" "Because I'm not sure you do." Morrison leaned forward. "Sergeant Chen, your presence in basic training is creating problems. Some recruits are inspired by your example, but others feel like they're competing in an unfair contest. The drill instructors are struggling to maintain appropriate relationships with both you and the other recruits. Sir, I believe I can still contribute value to the training program. I'm sure you can. The question is whether that value outweighs the problems your presence is creating." Morrison was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. "Sergeant Chen, I'm going to offer you two choices. You can continue with basic training, but we're going to have to acknowledge your background formally and modify your role accordingly. You'll essentially become an assistant instructor, helping train the other recruits. And the second choice? Advanced placement into our leadership development program. You'll skip the rest of basic training and move directly into advanced courses designed for experienced personnel." Sarah considered both options carefully. The first would mean giving up any pretense of being an ordinary recruit, while the second would mean abandoning the goal that had brought her to the Marines in the first place. "Sir, may I have some time to consider?" "You have until tomorrow morning. But Sergeant Chen, understand this. Whatever you decide, there's no going back. Your anonymity is gone forever." As Sarah walked back to the barracks, she reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed. 6 weeks ago, she had been just another recruit, ignored and occasionally harassed by instructors who assumed she was weak. Now she was being offered advanced placement and recognition of her expertise. But the thing she had wanted most, to be accepted as just another Marine in training, seemed to be slipping away forever. The next morning, Sarah gave Colonel Morrison her decision. She would continue with basic training, but she would formally accept the role of assistant instructor and mentor to her fellow recruits. It wasn't the anonymous service she had hoped for, but it was a chance to contribute to something larger than herself, and perhaps, in teaching others what she had learned through years of combat experience, she would finally find the new challenge and purpose she had been seeking. The last 4 weeks of training were unlike anything the platoon had experienced before. With Sarah's background now official, the drill instructors were able to incorporate advanced tactical scenarios and realistic combat training that would normally be reserved for much later in a Marine's career. The recruits who had initially resented her presence gradually began to understand the value of learning from someone with real experience. Even Davis eventually came around, admitting that her instruction had made him a better Marine. On graduation day, as Sarah stood with her fellow Marines, no longer recruits, she realized that her journey had taken an unexpected path. She hadn't earned acceptance through anonymity, but through demonstrating that experience and humility could coexist. That leadership meant lifting others up, rather than standing above them. The drill instructors who had once tried to break her down now shook her hand with genuine respect. Her fellow Marines, who had once questioned her presence, now considered her one of their own. Sarah Chen had finally found her place in the Marine Corps, not as someone pretending to be something she wasn't, but as someone willing to share her experience to make everyone stronger. The mocking had stopped long ago, replaced by respect earned through service, sacrifice, and the willingness to put the needs of the team above personal recognition. She was a Marine now, not because she had hidden her past, but because she had learned to use it in service of others.